Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 11th of October. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First, I'd like to say that the Russians continue their shelling and attacking of Ukrainian facilities, energy facilities, railroads facilities, all over the entire Ukraine. Yesterday I told you that the Russians won't do that, but I was wrong. As you can see, the Russians continue, and they decided to deal as much as possible damage, and they decided to prepare the Ukraine for something. Today we will try to discuss what the Russians are planning, what they're preparing for, and so on. If you take a look at the Russian sources map, you're going to see a lot of icons in the west part of Ukraine. The Russians attacked the main towns like Lvov, Rovno, Ivano-Frankovsk, like Vinnytsia, Khmelnytsky, and so on. Kiev was under attack as well. And it's just regular towns, and the Russians were trying to hit some kind of energy facilities, but there were few attacks that we need to pay attention to. The first one is attack in direction of town Shepetovka. This town is located in the west part of Ukraine, on the north of Khmelnytsky region, or in the southeast from Rovno. This Shepetovka. If we zoom in, you're gonna see that there is a railroad station, very big railroad station, and the Ukrainians are using this railroad station, this logistics center, for supplying and moving the Western weapon from the west part of Ukraine towards the east part of Ukraine. So as you can see, the Russians yesterday attacked they were attacking just energy facilities, power plants, and today they added another type of targets. They start attacking the railroad logistics centers because they understand that sooner or later the Western third countries are going to start supplying the Ukraine with more modern weapons like anti-aircraft, anti-missiles weapons. So that's why the Russians need to slow down them and so on. Now let's move to another important area we would like to discuss is Ladizhin, this small town. As you can see, according to this icon, the Russians attack these energy facilities in this town. Now let's move next. Another updates about Kryvyi Rog. Another important update. If we zoom in, we're gonna see that the Russians attack again the energy facility in this town as well. Another important update. And if we go into to the east from this area to the north first, the town of Volnogorsk, this one, as you can see according to this map, the Russians attacked almost the same energy facilities in this town as well. And if we're moving further to the east, we are moving to the Dnepro-Zaporozhye and Pavlograd. Very interesting updates are coming from Pavlograd because Pavlograd is the same logistics center as we just discussed minutes ago. As you can see, there is like a lot of railroads, and if we take a look at the Western sources map, you're going to see that Pavlograd is the focal point, and the Ukrainians are able to support, let's say, Avdiivka. This is our Avdiivka. As you can see, the railroad moves from Avdiivka towards Pavlograd, and also from Pavlograd, the Ukrainians are able to support, this is the railroad, Slaviansk-Kramatorsk. So this is a very important logistics center. And the Russians targeted this area, trying to reduce the Ukrainians' possibilities of supporting and supplying the front line, Slaviansk-Kramatorsk, Avdiivka, the east front line, with a modern weapon or any weapon at all. So this is about the attacks in this area. And also today the Russians attacked Kiev one more time, and they attacked another power plants, and this is the water power plant that located in Vyshgorod. Furthermore, today we got updates that not just the power plants were attacked in this area, but the Russians also attacked barracks in this area, and I believe that soon we are going to receive more updates about the loss from Ukrainian side. As we discussed yesterday, I told you that if the Russians stopped on the previous level of yesterday level of attack, that means that Ukrainians would need around, let's say, 20 days to restore everything with help, of course, the Western countries. But because of the fact that the Russians did another attacks today, that means that now we can add another 10 days for recovering the Ukraine from this crisis. And that means that today is 11th of October, so I believe that the Ukrainians, at least if the Russians stops, are able to restore everything, let's say, by the middle of November. And the middle of November is not critical, still not critical, because it's like autumn. Yes, it's already cold, but it's like south of Europe, south of Ukraine. It's the winter, of course, is very cold, but at least in November, the Ukrainians are still able to do something. But now we need to understand: are the Russians planning to continue their shelling tomorrow? So if they're planning to do this tomorrow, that means that we will be able to add another 10 days. That means that the Ukrainians will be able to restore everything by the end of November, and it is already critical situation. Another few days, and just by the end of the year. And if we're talking about the Ukrainians, today there were some meeting with the president of Ukraine. It's not, of course, the official data. It's some kind of spy data that we got from the Russian spies or something like this. They reported that if the Russians continue their shelling during the next 5-6 days, that means that Ukrainians won't be able to restore anything at all, ever. In this case, the Ukrainians will be able to use just the nuclear power plants, and they will have to stop any export of the electricity to the Western countries. They will have to shut down for some period of time during the day electricity all over the Ukraine. So the situation is not very nice during the winter period. But this is not the only important and interesting updates during today. And now let's talk about the front lines. As you can see, the front lines, at least the Ukrainian offensive operation front lines, are stable. The Ukrainians are trying to accumulate a lot of forces near Svatova, and they're preparing before the counter-offensive operation. They still can't do this, but anyway, they're preparing. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours of battles along Kupiansk-Liman front line, the Ukrainians lost around 60 soldiers and 8 armored vehicles. The Ukrainians made few attempts of recos in combat, but they were moved and they were forced to step back on their previous positions. The Russians are preparing their fortifications, and there were a lot of videos of massive constructing on this area, so they're prepared themselves. And the main thing that the Russians are not preparing just to defend themselves. Also, we understand that the Russians prepare for upcoming counter-offensive operation in this area, and we will discuss this a little bit later. If we are talking about the area about Bakhmut, let's say Seversk, Donetsk region, this long front line, there are no changes, just the only updates about Bakhmut. The Russians managed to take another few square meters, few blocks in this area, and today we got update that the Russians entered Ivangrad, this town right in the south of Bakhmut. So all this area between gray line and the green line is already under the Russians. This map is not updated, but I believe that maybe by the end of this week we are going to see updates. Furthermore, the Ukrainians who were defeated in Oputny Ivangrad in this area were forced to move in direction of Klishivka, this town, and now they're trying to prepare their fortification in this area to regroup and so on. So I believe that the Russians now will concentrate all their forces, all their power to take Kurdyumovka, Azaryanovka and Klishivka, these three towns. And if they're able to do this, maybe the Ukrainians will be forced to make a very difficult decision to leave Bakhmut, as the Russians did in the previous battles on the previous front line, like in Balaklia and so on, because if the Ukrainians decide to stay in Bakhmut and hold these towns, of course they're going to have very big losses. And we know that at least in this area, like Konstantinovka, Chasov Yar, Bakhmut, there are around 40,000 of Ukrainians, and that's a lot, of course. And at least the Russians need at least the same number of forces, because they have a lot. They have a lot more forces in their artillery and tanks, so that's why they can reduce the number of troops and infantry for storming operations. But anyway, that's a lot. If we are talking about the Zaporozhye area, the Ukrainians made a few attempts of recon in combat, but all the attacks were failed. Or maybe not failed, maybe it was just a task to understand, to do some recos. And if we are talking about the Zaporozhye area, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost around 30 soldiers and 4 armored vehicles. And by the way, have you mentioned that as soon as the Russians changed their focus from the front line, from the Ukrainian army, and started shelling the power plants and civilian facilities, the losses among the Ukrainian soldiers reduced very much. So if you remember, we used to talk like on the Kupiansk front line, the Ukrainian lost around 200 soldiers and 100 armored vehicles. The same situation in Bakhmut, another 1,000 soldiers, so on. Something like this. Of course, I'm talking softly, but anyway, these numbers that the Russians we have report. So that means that yes, the Russians changed their focus. Now they're attacking facilities, logistics centers, and this situation allows the Ukrainians for regrouping and, let's say, for to have a very nice and calm nights when they are able just sleep and to restore their power. As you can see, not everything is not so cool for the Russians. As you can see, they are not able to have concentrated fire on the Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian facilities. They need to do a decision, and during the first phase of the special operation, they were concentrating mainly by attacking the Ukrainian forces, and we saw the result that because of the big number of the Ukrainian forces, they don't care about these losses. They have a lot of reinforcements, a lot of infantry, lots of troops, and they were able to restore all their forces, and furthermore, they were able to do counteroffensive operation, and as a result of those counteroffensive operation, they got control and returned a lot of territories that were taken by the Russians. So that's why the Russians decided to change their focus. Now they're attacking the energy and logistic facilities. They understood that it's not, of course, it's not a waste of time, it's not a waste of rockets to attack infantry, to attack the manpower, but I understand that they understood that it is much more better to attack logistic and facilities, because without supply and support, these forces are useless. These forces, let's say if we're talking about the forces in Kupiansk, they are useless if they don't have reinforcement, if they don't have ammunition, shells, and so on. They can't start offensive operation because of absence of supply and support. So this is a very nice solution. And meanwhile, the Russians on the ground are able to, with artillery, whereas like tanks attacks, are able very slowly, of course, to reduce the Ukrainian forces very slowly, person by person. But anyway, maybe these tactics will bring the Russian more benefits than the tactics that they used to have in the first phase of this war. And the only big number we received from Nikolaev, Kherson area, the Russians report that Ukraine lost around 150 soldiers and 20 armored vehicles. And this is because of the fact that the Ukrainians still try to attack and still try to do some counteroffensive in this area, and just because of like storming the Russian position, their losses are so high. I believe that if the Ukrainians stop any offensive operation in this area, their losses among infantry, among manpower will be reduced as on every other single front line. So it's a very interesting situation. The Russians, we understand, are not able to support two types of attack, like against main power and against energy facilities. Maybe during this week the Russians will make a critical damage to the Ukrainian facilities, and then they will split, because they need to attack the forces manpower on the front line, because without attacking the Ukrainian front line, they allow the Ukrainians to accumulate a lot of forces that they are able to use in upcoming counteroffensive operation. So everything is very difficult, everything is very interesting, but let's follow the situation as well. Now let's talk about two another important updates that it's my observation and my understanding about the situation. The first one about Kharkiv area. Today we got, maybe you saw, maybe not, I saw a lot of videos, very interesting videos from this area, and I'll tell you what is that. The video was about from the regular cars, like a regular car where the regular civilians are driving and so on, and all those peoples were listening for radio, local radio. And the thing is that the Russians, by the fact that they managed to reduce the Ukrainian facilities, energy facilities in this area, the most important benefit, not the most important, but one of the benefits they managed to achieve is that they totally suppressed the local radio. And the people who were running on the roads in Kharkiv district were able to listen to Russian radio. And it was very interesting video. I will try to tell you the real text that the Ukrainian drivers were able to listen during this day. It was a military Russian voice, like a man, and he was saying the following: in Kharkiv region. It's very important because I haven't received this such confirmation on any other front line, because the situation with the infrastructure and facilities is the same, almost the same in every single region. But just in Kharkiv region, we got this update, this radio like sound. And the sound was the next. The Russian, the man voice was talking in Russian language. He was saying the following: "Dear citizens of Kharkiv region, we are Russian soldiers, and right now we are doing some special military operation in Ukraine. If you want to save your life, if you don't want to have unnecessary casualties and so on, you need immediately leave Kharkiv region." So it's very interesting because we discussed many times that the Russians managed to accumulate a lot of power in Belgorod. They're not they're not engaging them in this battle. They're allowing the Ukrainians to do some mass in the north of LPR, but the Russians are there in Belgorod, and they have a very powerful fist, and they're able to start something. And because of the fact that I've heard this radio in Kharkiv region, maybe that means something. That means something because most of us were expected that the Russians will try to take control over Kharkiv before winter. So maybe the Russians are planning to do something, and now we have some kind of evidence, at least from the locals, about the upcoming Russian plans. Another important update are coming from Belarus. Today, the head of special forces in Belarus, they have the same title as the Soviet Special Forces, KGB, the head of Belarusian KGB, reported that somewhere in November, he told us the following. He said that if the Russians are able to complete mobilization successfully, then in November or in December we're going to see totally changing of the situation in Ukraine. It will be like final changing in Ukraine. So of course he had a lot of numbers, he had a lot of information. It was some kind of insight from his side, but anyway, all these things are very connected. And another thing that I would like to discuss with you is the areas that the Russians are choosing for attacking the Ukraine. The Russians are trying to attack Kharkiv area because we understand that Kharkiv is a very powerful logistics center, and the Ukrainians need this area to regroup and so on. So that's why by shutting down Kharkiv from electricity, they cut the Ukrainians' possibilities to be mobile and flexible. We understand the same thing in Dnipro, Zaporozhye. This town is located on the river. There are trains, so that's why they need to shut down electricity and logistics center just to reduce the Ukrainian possibility of regrouping and so on. The same situation in Kryvyi Rog, Nikolaev. Furthermore, there are a lot of forces of Ukrainians in this area, and just to pin them down, not to allow them to be flexible. If we're talking about the western of Ukraine, we understand that most of the Western weapons are coming through this area, so that's why the Russians need to destroy infrastructure in this area just to slow down, to pin down the Ukrainians, and not to allow the Western weapon to arrive the east part of Ukraine. If we're talking about Kiev, the same situation, but maybe media victory, just to press and just to push, to press Zelensky and to make a negative situation in Kiev around this person, around mayor of this town and so on. We understand. But there are two regions in Ukraine that are not under any type of attack. And I'm talking about Chernigov region and Sumy region. This is two north regions in Ukraine, and these two areas were under Russian control during the spring and the winter of 2022. These two regions are not under attack. And this is very interesting if we are talking about upcoming plans of the Russians regarding Ukraine, and upcoming plans about Ukraine regarding Kharkiv and all these radio things in Kharkiv. I believe that because of the fact that the Russians are not destroying and reducing infrastructure and facilities in Chernigov and Sumy, in these two towns on the border, I believe that if the Russians are planning to start to open another front line or to attack with mobilized forces in this area. I believe that maybe the Russians will try to attack Sumy and Chernigov, and for many reasons. If we're talking about Sumy, of course, we understand that by attacking Sumy, the Russians will be able to cut Sumy region. They will be able to cut the road between Kiev and Kharkiv. Let's take the Western sources map. This Sumy, there is a railroad. You see that moves from Kiev to Kharkiv. So by cutting down this road, the Russians will be able to reduce the logistic power of Ukraine, of course. And if we're talking about Chernigov, this territory was in the beginning of this war under Russian control, and I believe that if the Russians are able to take control over Chernigov, then they will be able to return their forces on this line on the border of Chernigov, and of course from this area it is much more easier to attack Kiev, to control Kiev, and the most important, to force Kiev to start negotiation. Because while the Russians are very far from the capital of Ukraine, somewhere in Odessa, somewhere in Nikolaev, somewhere in Kramatorsk, it's like very far, and sometimes I believe that some Ukrainians think that maybe it's like some kind of other country, not even Ukraine. It is very difficult to force Zelensky to start negotiations. But as we see according to the world situation, we see that everybody wants some peacetime. The United States of America wants some peacetime. They want Biden to get another term as a president, or the Democracy Party is another term. The Germany wants to have their cheap gas. Everybody, I don't know. The civilians in Ukraine want to stop this war. The rich people from Russia want to start work with the European countries. Everybody are tired from this war, and the only one person who is between the peacetime and this war is Zelensky. And as I understand, nobody knows how to force him to stop this situation. And I believe that maybe if the Russians want to complete this story, they will take control over Chernigov and Sumy, and this is the reason why they're not attacking or shelling this area at all. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.